Well, we're 11 games into the season, which means it's time for a mid-season review of how the Bombers are going, and we're going to talk about a few things in this video, so you can grab a bit of a coffee or a snack or something, and we're going to get stuck into that right now. So normally 11 games would be the halfway point of the season. That's not quite the case at the moment. We have a 23-game season, which means technically half time of the Essendon Carlton game would be the exact halfway point of the season, but we're going to do it now after 11 games, the more traditional number of games that we're used to for being the halfway point. The first thing I wanted to look at was the personnel and which players have improved, which players have gone backwards, and which players are playing at around about the same level as what they were last year. Now, ideally, you want everyone to improve. That's not always realistic. But we have had quite a few players improve, in my opinion. But the first thing I'm going to have a look at is the players that are playing at pretty much the same level. They're not necessarily players that have improved. They haven't necessarily gone backwards. They are playing at really pretty much the same level. Whether they be good players or more mid-range players doesn't matter. It's really look at whether their output has gone up or down on last year. So the players that I've got that are playing at pretty much the same level as what they were last year, roughly, is I've got Zach Merritt, who obviously is, at the peak of his career. You wouldn't expect him to be improving his output on last year. He has kicked 8 goals. I'd like for him to perhaps have kicked a few more goals. Half of those came in one game, and there was a bit of talk that he was going to push forward this year, but it's not a criticism. He's playing at the same fantastic level that you would expect from our captain. On the weekend, he actually played in the back line, so he's not going to obviously kick goals from down there. He's obviously being asked to do the occasional role that is away from the midfield, which is a good thing. Sometimes when a tagger locks down on him, they'll throw him forward, or on the weekend, they decided to put him in the back line because we were short of defenders. So I realise you can't judge merit by goals kicked, even though a lot of people would say just to make him top him off as an even better player than what he is, it would be great if he could kick more goals. It's probably not going to happen just because of the different type of roles he's being asked to play, but he is really just playing at the same excellent level that we are used to over the last decade or so. I've got Nick Martin as well, who has kicked more goals this year, has kicked 10 goals this year. He kicked 15 for the entirety of last year, so he's on target to exceed that by a few goals, and that's a positive thing. I think he's playing a little bit more forward this year than what he was last year, but his output is pretty much the same. I've got Caldwell as well, who did have a couple of down weeks after the hamstring injury, but he had a fantastic first game of the season against Hawthorn, and also a fantastic, that game against Brisbane was one of his best games, and that third quarter was amazing. And when you take into account the hamstring injury, he is playing pretty much at the same level as last year. I think he's still got improvement in him. I think if it wasn't for the hamstring injury, we probably would see Caldwell as one of about 6 players I've got who have improved. But at this stage, based on his entirety of his season, I've got him as pretty much the same level as last year. Same as Setterfield. Redman, I've got at pretty much the same as last year. I don't think he has improved. I don't think he's necessarily gone backwards. I think his best season in recent times was 2023. He took a little bit of a step back last year, and he's just kind of just going. He's not quite there at the moment, but at least in my mind, I've got him at around the same level as what he was last year. If you guys disagree with any of this stuff, just let me know in the comments. These things are all opinion, and I'd love to hear what you've got to say. Other players who I've got around the same level as last year that haven't necessarily gone backwards or improved. Goldstein, obvious reasons, he's playing a great role, hanging in there and doing a great job in the ruck. Dersma, Ridley before he was injured. Laverty in the 3 games that he's played. Shield, who similar role to last year, kind of in and out of the side a little bit. And Andrew McGrath. Now, Andrew McGrath is an interesting case because Andrew McGrath has taken a bit of a hit statistically this year. His output is quite a bit down in terms of his ranking points, that sort of thing. But there's a bit more to it than that. He has been playing a bit more of a lockdown role this year on some of the best defenders in the game, which doesn't necessarily show up on the stat sheet. But he's got Bobby Hill, of Collingwood and Anzac Day to basically nothing. He kept Charlie Cameron to no goals. Well, one goal, which wasn't his fault. There was a 50-metre penalty given away by another player, which allowed Cameron to get a goal. So McGrath is having a slightly different role, even though his statistical output is down. But I think it's pretty reasonable to say that he's around the same level as last year. Given his roles that he's been playing, I might even be inclined to, say he's slightly improved. But just for the point of the exercise, it's close enough to the output that he has last year that I'll keep him as a player that is more or less the same as last year. Same with Perkins, even though Perkins has certainly increased his goal output. Perkins has scored 11 goals compared to 5 last year. I'm only halfway through the season. But despite that goal output, there's just some things about his game I think he still needs to work on. He seems to get a little bit confused as to where to run, where to go to when we haven't got the ball, that transition when we go from defence to attack or from attack to defence. He just seems to get a little bit, confused, and it just kind of frustrates me a little bit. But look, I can't deny that his goal output has certainly increased, and that's a positive thing. I think his future is more as a forward, in my opinion, than as a midfielder. I think he will play more of his career down there in the forward line. But yeah, just some of his, he's not what you'd call a footballer with a high footy IQ, if that makes sense. He's a really good athlete, and I think when he gets his footy IQ sorted, gets his running patterns a bit more sorted, I think he can become a better player. But I've got him at the same output as last year, as I have with Gresham, Hobbs, Sartis, who obviously has been in and out of the side like last year, and Menzie. So which players have I got who have improved for the Bombers, who are having better seasons this year than what they did last year? Because this is what we want. We want as many players in this category as possible. So I've got Sam Durham. Now, he had a pretty good year last year, but I think he's gone up a notch. And I think he is a player that definitely is an indispensable part of our team. The great thing about him as well is he kicks goals as well. I mean, he kicked 10 goals last year and he's kicked 6 this year. So he's on target to, at least match or maybe even exceed that. But I do think just from, regardless of the numbers he's putting up, I just think just from a purely the eye test, just from an observational point of view, I think he's improved each season he's been in the AFL, and he's a little bit better this year than what even he was last year. Sam Draper is the other one, unfortunately injured, of course, but he was having the best season of his career, and he was significantly better, I thought, than what he was last year and any other season he's been playing. I've been critical of Draper at times, but certainly can't deny that up until his unfortunate Achilles injury, he is definitely a player that has improved for us based on last year. I also have Peter Wright as a player that has improved. Surprisingly, if you remember last year, Peter Wright did cop a bit of criticism for, the usual kind of, he's got hands like iron, so doesn't clunk marks as he should for someone of his height. And there was a lot of talk before the season started that he was going to be on the outer, and if injuries had not gotten in the way, maybe he wouldn't have got in the team. I don't know. I suspect he was probably a little bit on the outer and might not necessarily have been in the plans for the team. But he has kicked 13 goals this year, kicked 19 last year, but it's not even about the goals. There's been matches where he hasn't really hit the scoreboard that I think he still played well. I think of the West Coast game where I remember he took a couple of important marks in key chains of possession that, were important phases of play. He's taking, he's getting involved in important passages of play and impacting those passages in a positive manner. And it's not all about the goals. Normally you would look at Peter Wright and go, well, he needs to kick goals, but he's having a pretty good influence even when he's not hitting the scoreboard, and he's definitely having a better season. In fact, he's averaging over 90 ranking points a game, which is about 20 ranking points higher than what he had last year. So hopefully he can keep that up. I've got Archie Roberts as well, another player who has improved on last year. This is not surprising, only played a couple of games last year being a rookie, but he is racking up the ball, averaging mid-20s per game. But not just that, he's a smart player. He seems like a leader already, even if he's not in the leadership group and probably won't be for a couple of years. I think he's the type of player that maybe in 8-9 years' time could be a candidate for captain. Right? I think he sort of understands the game. I think he's got a good footy IQ. and he is already one of the best players. I have heard some inside word that the coaches love him. They just love what he does, and certainly he's a player who has gone up. Zach Reed, of course, not surprisingly, another one before his unfortunate injury. Hopefully he gets back in 4 to 6 weeks, as the injury report says he will. Obviously having the best season of his career, one of the best intercept marks in the competition. Up until a couple of weeks ago when he went down, only Sam Taylor from GWS had a better record in terms of winning one-on-one contests. In fact, Zach Reed went about 6 consecutive weeks where his direct opponent didn't score a goal. So Zach Reed is another player who has improved. And the last player I've got who has improved is Nate Caddy. So Nate Caddy, not surprisingly, last year as a rookie, looked like he belonged, played a couple of good games, but obviously didn't really explode. And whilst he still hasn't had that absolute breakout game yet, he came kind of close against Brisbane. But certainly this year, I mean, he's kicked 14 goals already, and he kicked 9 for all of last year. And he is a player that will, I think, with his height, as he continues to build up, he's still young, of course, he's going to be a very, very intimidating player for opposition backmen, and he'll get better and better for each of the first 5 or 6 years of his career. So I've got Durham, Draper, Wright, Roberts, Reed, and Caddy as the 6 players who have actually improved on last year. Now, the 3 players I've got who have gone backwards, and there are reasons, and I don't want to dwell on this because, look, there are, it's tough being an AFL footballer, and that's it. So I'm not going to, it's not so much a criticism as it is just an observation. I think Harrison Jones has struggled a little bit and is a little bit down on his output from last year. I still think he's the kind of player that kind of needs a position. He was recruited really as a forward, remember, and he hasn't really played as a forward, and maybe he should. But look, unfortunate injury with the ankle, but the reality is I think his output this year is lower than what it was last year. Mackay as well. I think Mackay, the biggest problem I think Mackay's probably had, and it's not all about numbers and possessions. I do go on about that a little bit, but it's not about that. But there's a number of games where I only had 3 kicks. And even if you're a backman, you don't need to link up and be involved in chains of possession. It's not just about winning one-on-one contests, which he does well. I mean, people knock Mackay, but he does win the vast majority of one-on-one contests that he's involved in. But I think it's also reasonable to suggest that his output this year has decreased from last year. And the last one is Langford. Now, Langford, it's probably unfair having him on the list because he's been injured a little bit, but even when he did come back from his hamstring injury, he was still struggling. And he's just, not... Look, he probably needs an uninterrupted few games to get back to that level. But nevertheless, it is reasonable to say that, excuses or not, and there are valid reasons for his, little bit decline in performance this year, his output certainly is down. So I've got Harrison Jones, Mackay, and Langford as the three players who have decreased in, performance this year. There's a few players who I'm not rating simply because they're rookies and they only played this year, or they just haven't played enough games. So I've got Tom Edwards, Archer Day Wicks, Sardell Hooley, Kako, Zach Johnson, Matt Guelphy, because only played a couple of games, Nick Bryan with the injury, Lewis Hayes, Pryor, and Clark. Angus Clark, who I'm not rating based on last year. I'm not comparing them to last year or anything like that, because I think that's just because of the fact that they either haven't played enough games or they are rookies themselves who didn't play last year, or in the case of Jackson. Of those players who I'm not rating because they didn't play for Essendon last year, there are 2 that have played 11 games. You've got Kako and Jackson Pryor. So if you want me to just give them a rating on how I think they've performed this year, irrespective of what they've done prior, just on their performances this year, I think Pryor started slowly but has got better. I would actually give him a 6 out of 10. I think I would have probably given him a 3.5 or a 4 out of 10 after about 4 games. But I think he has slowly got better and he's matured into a pretty reliable defender, something he probably wasn't in the first 2 or 3 weeks. So I would actually give him a 6 out of 10. He's averaging about 70 ranking points and has played every game. So you have to give him that. I think Kako is probably in a position where he needs to get games into him to immerse himself into the difficult position of what it's like to be a small forward in the AFL. And he hasn't really produced a lot of goals, but he has given us a little bit in terms of his effort, his chase downs, the things that you don't really notice. I would probably just give him a rating of 5.5 out of 10 this year. So that is who I think has stayed the same. I don't want to use the word stagnated because it sounds like a criticism. To say Zach Merritt has stagnated is not a criticism. You wouldn't expect him to be improving. But it's just a list of the players who I think have played at the same level, or at least roughly the same level from last year to this year. I've got 6 players improving and 3 players who have decreased. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. So what are some of the ticks, some of the positives that we can point to that we're happy with in the first half of this season? Well, probably the big one is the debut of 7 players. I think that is something we perhaps didn't see coming, at least not to that extent. 7 players within a half of a season is a really, really good move, I think. Tom Edwards, Archer Day-Wicks, Saad El-Houli, Isaac Kako, Zach Johnson, Lewis Hayes, and Angus Clark. One knock or previous knock that people have criticised Brad Scott for is the fact that he doesn't debut enough young players. Well, I don't think you can level that at him after this. 7 players debuting. Some would say, well, it wouldn't have happened if we didn't have the injuries. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think the injuries tend to have fallen in positions where we have tall players and rucks, and that really hasn't been where the debutants have happened. Archer Day-Wicks, Saad El-Houli, Kako was always going to debut anyway. Zach Johnson's a small player. These are kind of midfielders. Hayes probably is the only one that perhaps might not have come in had the injured players been there. Angus Clark was debuted as a wingman in his first game and played on the wing in the couple of games in the VFL prior. So I think the ascension of a lot of these young players has been a positive for the club. And I think I like the look of a lot of them as well, particularly Angus Clark and Zach Johnson. I think they're going to be 200-game players potentially for the Bombers. Doesn't always work out for everybody, of course, but I think that is a positive for the Bombers so far. I also think off-field, the club seems pretty stable. I think this is good. Whether you agree with the decision to re-sign Brad Scott for another year, the club and the board do seem to be reasonably stable and united in their vision, and I think this is a good thing. These things can change, but really, right now, I think we're a relatively stable club, and I would put that as a tick so far. Some of the negatives, well, I think the game plan still needs a little bit of work. I'm still not sold on the high possession game plan. It hasn't really worked against the better teams who have managed to shut down and stop the uncontested mark game. The silver lining of that is I think we may have seen a little bit of a change at halftime in the Brisbane game, and I suspect that the coaching staff will probably run with that a little bit, and we'll see a little bit more of an open game plan as the season progresses. We haven't really seen that to this point in the season, but the reality is, and look, the coaching staff aren't stupid. They're going to look at the last probably 6 or 7 weeks where we've been absolutely impotent in the forward line, and they're not going to obviously let that continue. They're going to obviously work on how they can fix that. I think a lot of the problem is going straight down the line from the wing. I think it's better to change up the angles. You see clubs like Melbourne, who were struggling early and have now started to do kind of what GWS does, where they transition play from one side of the ground to the other, changing the angles of kicks coming out of the back line and things like that, playing on quickly. It's something obviously we need to do, but the game plan really has, I don't think, been a pass so far. I think it's been focused too much on defending with the ball. There was a lot of criticism of Essendon that we couldn't defend, so we've started defending with the ball. I don't really think that's the right way to defend. I think you've got to learn to defend without the ball and actually stop opposition when they have the ball, rather than just chipping it around and saying, oh, look, we're stopping the opposition, we have the ball. I don't think that's sustainable long term. And even though our defence has managed to concede some low scores, one of the big problems is that we are the second worst team in the competition for opposition scoring off our turnovers. Only West Coast is worse, and you can almost take West Coast out of the equation because they're so bad. So we're the second worst team in the competition for opposition scoring off turnover, and turnover is the biggest score source. The interesting thing is, and this is another tick at the halfway point, is that we're the best team in the competition at stopping the opposition scoring from stoppages. We're number 1. And it's a good thing to be number 1 at stopping the opposition scoring from stoppages. The problem is you'd rather be number 1 at stopping the opposition scoring off turnover, because you score about twice as much off turnover as stoppage. And I guess this is part of my criticism of some of the things that Essendon have been doing over the last couple of years, is that we seem to be good at the things that are not as important. Does that make sense? And we seem to be bad at the things that are important. I mean, it's good that the opposition doesn't score off stoppages against us. We're the best in the competition. That's fantastic. I love that. Tick, tick, tick. More of it, please. But obviously it's terrible that the opposition scores off us from turnover more than any other team, and turnovers account for more than twice as many scores as stoppages. So it is frustrating that we tend to focus on or be good at the things that are not as important. That's something the club needs to work on, because it's a case of being efficient with your priorities. You need to prioritise on the things that are important and put less priority on the things that are not important. So overall, how would I rate the output of the team in terms of the ladder? Well, there's two ways you can look at it. We've got more wins than losses. That's a positive. 6 wins, 5 losses. We have a percentage of 85. Now, percentage of 85, I think the percentage is probably a better indicator of where we're at. I think most of you would agree. We need a percentage well up over 100 if we're going to be contending for the finals or to be a serious football team. Then again, it is a win-loss industry as well, and given that it is a win-loss industry, you do have to take into account that the wins are important, even though some of those close wins could have very easily gone the other way. So look, I give the team a 5 out of 10, which is really kind of a 4 out of 10 for your percentage, and maybe a 6 out of 10 for our win-loss, for basically a bare pass at this point of the year. There's still a lot for us to work on. I don't think we're always going to get it right in this season. I think the big focus is on next year and the seasons beyond. I know people do get frustrated. It always seems to be about next year and not the current season. But given that the introduction of so many young players and the fact that we do seem to be transitioning into a kind of different phase of the team, I think it's reasonable to look at next year as a really, really big year for us. And this year, look, it is a little bit of a transition year. I think there will be some big decisions to be made at the end of the season. We've already delisted 20 players in Brad Scott's time at the club. We've got 47 players to get down to approximately 38 or so. So it looks like we're going to have another 8 to 10 delistings potentially. So that'll be 30 players or around that within 3 years. So that's a huge amount of players. That's 3/4 of a list nearly in 3 seasons. So they're big decisions, but it is exciting times for us. So look, I give us a bare pass. I give us a 5 out of 10. We've got more wins than losses, which is a surprise. We've got a poor percentage, but I think in the end, it's a win-loss industry. We've introduced 7 young players, and I think the prospects for the future probably outweigh some of the poor performances that we've had against Adelaide and the Western Bulldogs and things like that. So what do you guys think of the performance at the halfway point? Is there anything I've missed? Do you agree with it? I'm certain there's things that you won't agree with. Let me know. Leave a like on this video. Subscribe to this channel. Have a great day, everybody. And as always, go Bombers.
Try their best, but they can't get near.